Hello, my name is Isabella Moritz. This is a recording of the talk that I presented at the Costume Society of America's annual symposium on June 1st, 2026. I'm a recent graduate of the Fashion and Textile Studies Master's Program at the Fashion Institute of Technology. In the fall of 2023, when I was asked to select a topic for my master's thesis, I had just spent a summer working with fashion and textile curator Alden O'Brien on her Sewn in America exhibition. In that time, the objects I encountered and the conversations that I had with Alden prompted my interest in altered garments. After asking my professors about any altered garments in the department's graduate study collection, I encountered this ensemble in the state pictured here. A previous student had extensively and beautifully conserved it, but a major problem still remained that kept the garments languishing in a box instead of being used as a learning tool. At some point during the garment's history, the waistband to this skirt went missing. Aside from this, a number of other curious aspects became apparent, and overall, the garment did not seem to neatly fit into the style of any late 19th century periods. As this object was donated in the chaos of the pandemic years and had not yet been formally accessioned, it had been separated from any provenance that may have been provided by the donor. Due to its incomplete state and lack of provenance, it ceased to serve a purpose within the collection that it had ended up in, a type of death for a historic fashion object. I was immediately faced with two guiding questions. How many lives did this garment live before it ended up in the FTS graduate study collection? And how could I return it to a state where it could be safely and ethically mounted in 3 dimensions? These two questions led me to my goal for my thesis: the assembly of a, quote, robust reconstruction of the lives that this ensemble had experienced based on the evidence encoded within the material remains using Malcolm-Davies framework. The first 2 chapters of my thesis cover the process of reconstructing the ensemble's absent biography, and the 3rd chapter details the process of physically reconstructing the ensemble's missing elements in order to mount and document the object. This talk will be a brief overview of that entire process. Before diving into the details of the project, I had to situate my research within the current landscape of emerging reconstruction theories, definitions, and methodologies as they applied to conservation practice. In the early days of fashion conservation, every treatment was deemed a, quote, restoration carried out by, quote, restorers. In the last 2 decades or so, there has been a more formal push by those at the intersection of fashion history and conservation to use more specific terminology to the different processes that restoration used to encompass. Reconstruction has 2 definitions in the field, and both apply to this project in different ways. The first is the act or process of, quote, rebuilding, or, quote, putting together again, especially following damage or destruction. The second definition is the, quote, recreation or reimagining of something from the past, especially by using information acquired through research. The definition of restoration is the act or process of returning something to a, quote, an unimpaired or improved condition. Part of the reason for this shift has been that restoration has a complicated relationship with the field of fashion and textile conservation because of its association with highly interventive treatments and its connotation with the judgment of an object's value as having been better in its original state. Yet, as Sarah Scaturro points out, restoration of the aesthetic, 3-dimensional ideal is often demanded of fashion objects, and if they cannot fulfill that function, they are relegated to their second and sometimes final death, languishing unused in a collection or even deaccessioned. In 2006, René Dancause systematically evaluated a sample of textile conservation treatments, terminology usage, identifying restoration, reconstruction, replication, recreation, and reproduction. She found that over decades of treatments, terms were used interchangeably and inconsistently by conservators to describe the same processes as different terms or the same term for different processes. In response to the gap in methodological outlines and noted inconsistency of term usage identified by Dan Cause, in 2016, Hilary Davidson reviewed the most commonly employed terminology used to describe this approach and each word's official definition as set forth in the Oxford English Dictionary. In 2023, Jane Malcolm-Davies proposed a hierarchy of the application of terms as defined by Davidson. At the top is replication, which is the, quote, exact duplication of a historic object. Below that is reconstruction, which employs, quote, justifiable speculation. Below that is recreation, which is a result of guesswork and imagination. Restoration was not included in her hierarchy of terms. This project uses each of the above terms to denote different phases of the physical reconstruction process. Renee Dancause also pointed out the lack of guidelines for reconstruction as a conservation treatment from the American Institute of Conservation, citing the most relevant passage as Guidelines of Practice number 21, Treatment Suitability, which reads, quote, the conservation professional should only recommend or undertake treatment that is judged suitable to the preservation of the aesthetic, conceptual, and physical characteristics of the cultural property. She encouraged North American conservators to also consider the Canadian Code of Ethics and Guidance, which defines reconstruction as, quote, all actions taken to recreate in whole or in part a cultural property based upon historical, literary, graphic, pictorial, archaeological, and scientific evidence. Reconstruction is aimed at promoting an understanding of cultural property and is based on little or no original material, but clear evidence of a former state. As this project sits at the intersection of the reconstruction versus restoration debate, I hope it can serve as a case study of the application of the various relevant terms to the treatment of a historical fashion object in a conservation setting. So that brings us to part one, historical reconstruction, by which I mean the reconstruction of the object's absent history. My historical reconstruction combined Prown's framework for assembling an object biography with Malcolm-Davies' framework for reconstructions. Through this process, I aimed to determine what could be deduced in the absence of provenance information about the history and use of the ensemble in question using only evidence embedded in the material. So that brings us to the object biography. Looking at only artifactual primary sources, aka the ensemble. I began with description and deduction. In the skirt of the original ensemble, I observed inconsistent thread heights and stitch lengths. The skirt had a mix of hand and machine stitched seams, and some of the embroidered pansies were stitched over the seams, and some were sewn into them, suggesting that they were embroidered after the initial construction, but reworked into the alteration. The waist yoke was awkwardly pieced to preserve flowers that had previously been embroidered. The fringe was worked continuously over altered seams and stitch holes from the past trim. Here are some multiple views of the bodice to orient you before I look into the description of that. The bodice had applied fringe, applied pansies, and bizarre piecing of silk fi and silk velvet. The collar was backed with plain silk fi, but the fringe was worked through after its construction. The Petersham waist tape listed Fanet and Béer, which is a previously unstudied French couture house. I traced their history through French and American primary sources, including annual almanacs and published diaries of socialites, and at their peak, they were listed amongst the now more well-known houses such as Worth. Mesdames Fanet and Béer were open at the first address in 1865 or 1866, and it burned down during the end of the Paris Commune in May 1871. By August of that year, they had relocated to the address listed on this label. They went their separate ways in 1876, and Madame Fanet stayed at this address while Madame Béer relocated and opened her own house specializing in children's clothing. This timeline places the initial construction of this garment between 1871 and 1876, and the Petersham waist tape was reused during its later alteration. The label was also useful for locating another, roughly contemporary garment to the one I was studying. This ensemble is housed at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. I decided to visit these garments in person to examine it in what I assumed to be their unaltered state. And due to the coloring of the photo online, which you can see in the top left corner, I was expecting to see a magenta ensemble. Instead, I found an ensemble in much more similar colorway to the garment that I was studying, which I color corrected in the photos on this slide. A detailed examination of the Connecticut skirt showed a similarity in the stitch lengths to the original seams of the FIT skirt, and in places with more fading, the thread had faded to the same color as parts of the FIT skirt. Additionally, both ensembles used silk fi with a similar hand and the same selvage width of 25.5 inches. And when I looked inside the middle drapery of the Connecticut skirt, the unfaded color of the silk fi was almost the same as the unfaded areas of the FIT skirt, which is really hard to capture on camera due to differences in lighting. Since the Connecticut ensemble retained all of its original passementerie, I was able to examine how the trims were applied. The stitch pattern of the trimmings applied to the Connecticut skirt were very similar to the shapes of the stitch hole clusters that I had observed on the FIT skirt. The Connecticut dress and the FIT dress's hems were worked with the same whip stitch technique with approximately the same stitch and hem widths. The Connecticut dress also had all of its original silk fringe, which was applied as single units to each hem at roughly the same intervals as the stitch holes on the FIT dress's hem. So it's likely that in its original state, the FIT ensemble had fringe like this. Where the fringe was applied to the bodice, however, the Connecticut bodice employed a separate braid that the fringe was worked through before being applied by hand using a whip stitch, while the FIT bodice had new fringe worked through a scrap of the silk fi and was applied with a machine. After focusing most of my energy towards the skirt, near the end of my appointment, a closer look at the bodice revealed that it too had been altered, not drastically changing the style, but making the bodice slightly larger. Seams were let out, and bizarre piecing helped to extend parts of the bodice, and some machine top stitching was added around the alterations. Comparison of the two waist tapes revealed the same logo and address, but different materials. The FIT bodice had a twill, while the Connecticut bodice used a ribbed watered silk. However, when the Connecticut bodice was let out, the waist tape was extended by 1.5 inches, and the extension is made of the same twill tape as the FIT waist tape employed. This suggests that the Connecticut alterations were performed in-house by Fanet and Béer. This also suggests that first the Connecticut dress was made, then it was altered around the time that the FIT dress had been originally made. The FIT dress had to also have been made before the logo and Petersham would have changed after the breakup of Fanet and Béer in 1876, and its original waist tape was simply reused in its turn-of-the-century alteration. The final fascinating detail that came from this is that when the Connecticut ensemble was altered, the new waist measurement became 27.5 inches, the same as the waistband of the FIT dress. While many women could have had the same waist measurement at this time, I found it really intriguing that two ensembles by the same now unknown French couturiers, with the same measurements and even employing the same materials, ended up in the United States merely a state apart. Though I hope to one day learn the provenance of the FIT ensemble, I felt that it was not out of the realm of possibility that perhaps these ensembles could have once belonged to the same woman who brought them over to the US. To tie this work in with the greater context and assemble the object biography, I used pictorial and documentary primary sources to see how these ensembles aligned or departed with major stylistic trends of the time periods that I suspected the FIT ensemble had been constructed and then altered. Here's another glimpse of the two ensembles side by side to bear in mind as I quickly go through these plates. As I sifted through plates from 1870s, 1875 was the first that I began to see floral embroidery on bodice and drapery panels crop up, along with the style of the draped overskirts and fringe. Also in 1875, purple seemed to be a popular choice, especially layering with multiple shades. The left image bears significant resemblance to the Connecticut ensemble, where the right image bears a similar shade, drapery length, and Van Dyke edges to the FIT ensemble. Whereas I initially suspected that the FIT ensemble was a demi-mourning ensemble due to the color and embroidered pansies, which are a symbol of remembrance, it's also possible that it was simply a popular color for fashionable dress, being that the ability to achieve purple with synthetic dye only emerged 2 decades earlier. If it was a demi-mourning ensemble, its alteration could have been a result of a change in ownership at some point, because there was a very large market for secondhand mourning clothes. The popularity of purple embroidered, draped bustle dresses with fringe and Van Dykes persisted into 1876, after which point the style of dress shifts from the first bustle period into the princess line. After reviewing comparanda and these fashion plates, among many more, it's my hypothesis that the FIT ensemble began its first life in 1875 or 76. Jumping to the FIT ensemble's second life, through comparison with extant garments, Janet Arnold, and many fashion plates from 1900 to 1908, I was able to pinpoint the style of the alteration to circa 1902 to 1904, due to the style of the bodice, the many pleats, the shape of the sleeve with the pouching at the wrist. Additionally, light purple seemed to still be a popular color choice, and with the streamlining of the silhouette, there likely would have been more than enough material from the 1870s ensemble to rework into a completely new bodice. It's also likely that there used to be a coordinating underskirt, and as styles continued to change and simplify over the next handful of years, my hypothesis is that the underskirt went on to live a third life as a more subdued cord skirt, able to be paired with any number of interchangeable shirtwaist blouses that became the prevailing style. Or, as someone recently suggested to me, perhaps that alteration was undertaken by a theater costuming department. This date for the alteration is substantiated by articles printed in the Ladies' Home Journal between 1901 and 1905, instructing the thrifty every woman in how to rework her old clothes to suit changing styles. They describe taking old lace to make blousy vests, making bodices whose waists have rounded backs and tapered fronts, false jackets, sleeves with, quote, scant puffs, and a rage for velvet ribbon, accordion or tucked pleating, and Van Dyke trimmings. They provide details on making over old skirts, for which the drop hem becomes popular, and how to redo skirts with inlaid box pleats. All of these are stylistic details which appear in the FIT ensemble's alterations, and suggest that by the time that these tips are making it to the home sewist, it's very likely that professional dressmakers and couture houses are also undertaking similar alterations. So the ensemble's alterations could have been done by the skilled sewist either at home or professionally. As part of the examination process, I reviewed the condition and treatment reports prepared by the previous student conservator who worked on this object, and built on their work with my own microscopic fiber analysis and assembly of a full treatment report for the work I performed. These reports are all included as appendices to the thesis. In combination with the thesis, which is itself a type of narrative report, these documents serve as, to quote Sarah Scaturro, the, quote, truth imparting assurance that enabled me to intervene on the object, no longer as an objective observer, but as an interpreter and, quote, surrogate creator of the object's future life. Furthermore, without all of the tedious primary source research done throughout this stage, I would not have had all the information I needed to guide my material and stylistic choices made throughout the physical reconstruction process. I used Malcolm-Davies' SMART, S-M-A-R-T, reconstruction model to guide this project. Early on, I defined the, quote, specific purpose of the reconstruction as returning the ensemble for documentary purposes to a state of, quote, rematerialized fashionability at the time period for which the most evidence still remained with the least material intervention on the object, while also ensuring that the reconstruction upheld current ethical standards for fashion conservation. Since the output of this process would be a recreation underskirt and a conservation-safe interlining, I produced patterns of the original skirt to aid in that process. I began by using the mylar tracing technique and then transferred the patterns to gridded pattern paper. This also allowed me to adjust the patterns back to their original full selvage width. From the gridded paper, I was able to create a digital version of all the pattern pieces. I found, like many other scholars working in the field of reconstruction and reproduction, that this process forced me to observe and record the construction of the skirt in much greater detail than a standard condition map. I was forced to reckon with every stitch and every stitch hole because I could be responsible for replicating each and every one of them. My patterns record what each pattern piece is shaped like, but they also document all of the seams present and whether they were original or altered, hand or machine stitched, as well as any, quote, ghost seam evidence. This pattern was also useful to calculate yardage because I could arrange each piece digitally. First, I used my pattern to calculate how many yards of material went into the construction of the original skirt as it currently exists by aligning all of the selvages of the patterns with the width of the fabric. This told me that the original selvage width was 25.5 inches and that 5 yards, 9 inches of material was necessary if the pieces were arranged as efficiently as possible. Having the pattern also allowed me to be efficient and save money on the purchase of silk habiti to create my conservation-safe interlayer, as I was able to predict with accuracy that I needed just under 4 yards of material because the silk habiti that I was ordering was 44 inches wide. I ordered 4 yards just to be safe and arranged all the pattern pieces exactly as I planned digitally. I ended up with exactly as much extra material as is pictured here. Furthermore, having a pattern allowed me to compare what currently exists of this skirt with other historical patterns and garments in order to discern what might be missing or incorporated into the construction of the bodice at a later date. Because I had already made a pattern for the FIT skirt, I wanted to compare it to the closest sized layer of the Connecticut skirt, for which I made this approximated pattern. Based on the number of panels present and where I know the alterations to have occurred, it's possible that the FIT skirt had at least 2 entire panels removed, or at the very least trimmed down significantly to form the godets. It is also likely that it originally had pockets. Comparing the shape of the back panel, which were the easiest to get the definitive shape of due to the presence of the selvages, shows that they were similarly constructed, so the FIT skirt may have once been much more gathered towards the back of the skirt like the Connecticut was. After my experience with this aspect of reproduction, I'm now an advocate of producing patterns of a historical garment to create a more robust conservation record, even if there's no attempt to materially recreate it at that point in time. It becomes especially useful if the object in question has been altered. If a material recreation will be attempted, this technique is exceptionally useful for predicting yardage to avoid buying too little or too much fabric. The style of the bodice of the FIT dress clued me in to the fact that the alteration likely occurred around 1902 to 1903. In order to produce a replica underskirt from around that time period, I consulted this pattern from Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion 2 and adapted the pattern to have a train the appropriate length to the original garment. Pictured here are all the various elements that I produced. First, I made muslin mock-ups, or toiles, to test out the patterns that I had taken from the original object and the pattern I drafted for the recreation underskirt. This exercise was useful because it allowed me to correct my patterns. The center back panel needed to be 4 inches longer, which I realized through trial and error, which pieces were assembled in what order. The mock-up of the underskirt pattern was also easily transformed into a custom petticoat to support the object for mounting through the addition of a finished hem and a ruffle. Next, I constructed the recreation underskirt from a modern silk fly, and I machine pieced the seams and hand finished the hem using the same technique as the original skirt. Then, because the expensive new silk fly couldn't be washed without affecting the hand and appearance, I created a replica of the original skirt out of washed silk habiti to serve as a barrier between the original garment and the recreated underskirt. This step was ethically important especially if this ensemble were ever to be displayed for a longer period of time. Finally, I added the original skirt on top of all of these layers, and thankfully, the habiti layer was invisible, and the silhouette was consistent with the fashionable silhouette circa 1902. Here is a detail of my hand-finished underskirt hem next to the hem of the original object. They both have approximately the same number of stitches per inch, and after a bit of practice, I was able to get my hem even narrower to match the width of the original hem. For the original skirt, it still needed a waistband, so I made one of washed muslin to be the same dimensions as the waistband inside the bodice. I had calculated with my muslin replica how many inches of material needed to be folded into the box pleats at center back. And fascinatingly, when I went to attach the new waistband, the material had crease memory and neatly folded itself back into the same depth of pleats that I had predicted. This told me that the alteration had been completed and remained in this state long enough for the material to remember the shape. It suggested that the waistband and original underskirt went missing after that time period. All of the recreated elements were labeled before going into storage so that a future conservator or curator does not mistake them as original to the ensemble. This is an ethical point made by several scholars writing about reconstruction, as well as some conservation codes of ethics. One final element of this project was the insight gained into the ensemble through physically reenacting its creation. In finishing the hem by hand, I found that due to the stiffness of the material, especially when rolled into a hem, which creates 3 layers to pierce with every stitch, it made it impossible to place the stitches any closer together without slowing down my natural flow. It also allowed me to estimate how many hours of now unnamed labor went into just this one detail, which inspired an experiment to determine the same for the embroidery of a single pansy. My pansy, pictured here, which I modeled after the smallest variation still present on the skirt, took me 5 3/4 hours to complete, and it had an estimated of 1,035 full satin stitches, as in front to back and then back to front being 1 stitch. Assuming that a professional couture embroiderer working on this dress in the 1870s could stitch at least as fast as my fastest pace, not my average, each of the smallest pansy variations would still take at least 3 hours to complete. On the original ensemble, there remains evidence of at least 183 embroidered pansies, which accounts for a minimum of 549 hours of labor, not accounting for the fact that the larger pansies require more surface area to be covered, thus requiring more stitches and more labor. I found that these tacit experiences were incredibly informative to my understanding of this ensemble, and it allowed me to approximately quantify the appreciation I was feeling for the original makers in a way that could be more easily understood by non-makers. So here is the result of my project, a fully realized mounting of the original ensemble with all of the recreated elements. And to return to the original debate, all of the reconstruction done on this ensemble was in service of the restoration of the ensemble's 3-dimensional ideal that's expected of fashion objects, so that in its present and future lives, it can again serve the needs of the collection that it resides in. It's my hope that this talk illustrated the scholastic potential of reproduction when applied at the intersection of fashion conservation and traditional academic approaches to fashion history, where conservation can benefit from the theoretical support to a technique which the field has long employed, and reproduction can be legitimized as an academic approach to materiality inherent to the study of fashion history. Here you've got some primary sources and some secondary sources. Continued. Thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out to me at this email pictured here if you happen to have any questions or comments regarding this talk.